Hey guys, welcome back to our video series on Introduction to JavaScript. In this video, over the next two videos, I would like to talk about how we can structure and organize our code into functions and objects. Now, you guys have already seen objects. You've seen the document object. You're studying for the document object. You've seen an array object. But we're going to talk about how to create our own user-defined objects, right? Let me just say a little bit about functions. There's a lot of different types of functions. Functions are extremely useful in that they allow us to group statements together that perform a specific task. And we could call the functions multiple times during the runtime of our program. This helps prevent us from having to write the code every time that we want to run some similar statements in our program. If we had to write it every time in our program, that would cause our code to be very bulky and long. But rather, we can prepackage the code into functions, and then we can call those functions whenever we need to achieve that specific task. Sometimes you'll hear different developers use the term method and function interchangeably. Really, a method is a function, which is a set of instructions that perform a particular task. The difference is that a method is associated with an object, while a function is not. So here in JavaScript, I want to talk about three different types of, well, more specific, I want to focus on two different types of functions, but there is a third one here called a self-invoking function that you sometimes rarely see. A name function is indicative of what it says. It has a name, right? An arrow function, it has an arrow in a function. And so we're going to do an example. I'm going to show a few examples using the program that we wrote in other previous videos. So let's take a look at this. I'm going to bring up my editor and let's dive into anonymous functions and name functions. All right, so here's our code that we've been working on throughout these videos. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to point your attention to line 79 and line 86. So line 79, we actually are using something called an anonymous function. And so everything that I have highlighted here is considered an anonymous function. Oops, let me go back up. The reason why it's an anonymous function is because it doesn't have a name, right? Whenever you're defining a function, you have to use the function keyword. And then we know that it's a function because of the open and closing parenthesis. So this is an actual example of an anonymous function. Let me show you the difference between an anonymous function and a named function. Now what I'm going to do here is I'm going to copy these statements. I'm going to create a named function. If my keyboard will work. There we go. And I'm going to name this function date output. I call it, you have to use the reserved keyword function. I'm going to say date output. And you have to do that here. Now, this is the syntax. You just have to commit this to memory. That's the syntax of a function. The reserved keyword, and like I said, this is a named function. We gave it a name called date output, and we have the opening closing bracket, parenthesis, and then opening closing squiggly bracket. And then our statements go in between. Now this is different now. People have done Python, you know that the indentation is what groups the statements for that particular function. Now it doesn't matter about indentation. It doesn't matter. Indentation is not a thing here within JavaScript. You can, as long as the statements are in between the opening and closing bracket. What I'm going to do here is I'm going to paste these. I'm going to actually recopy this here, and I'm going to paste these statements within this function, and I'm going to get rid of this anonymous function, and then I'm going to call this function using its name, date output. And that's it, really. So now we're using a named function called date output that we've defined here between lines 85 and 91. And it's going to perform the same, right? The only thing that we did was we created a name function called date output. We have three statements, and then we're invoking it here on line 79 as the second argument to the add event listener method. So let's save this and see if it still performs the same. So let's right click and open this in the browser. So we should get the date here. Yep, it still works the same. And then obviously the student function works as well. So going back to here, we saw an example of a named and anonymous function, and we're going to do a lot more with this in the next few videos here. But essentially, a name function has a name, but you have to use the keyword function in front of it, and then you have to just remember the syntax of it. Let's take a look at an arrow function, right? So an arrow function is pretty much the same as an anonymous function. Is this a shorter syntax? So if we go back and pull up our code and watch this here. So we have a function on line 81. Now I'm going to show you, here's what an arrow function looks like. With the arrow function, we can get rid of the reserved keyword and just use the open and close in bracket. And then we have to use the arrow, and that's an arrow function. Just that simple, right? And so it works, and this should work and perform the same here, right? So if we save this and we go back to our browser, refresh, there's our date, and then this is what's going to call the arrow function. There's the output for our student. Now, what I'm going to do is, before I wrap up this video with named functions, arrow functions, anonymous functions, let's actually do an example of another function here. What we're going to do is we're going to take in some information from our student that we have here. The name of the student is Joe. And what we're going to do is we're going to calculate how many years does Joe have until he retires. And so what I'm going to do, I'm going to create a name function. I'm going to call this function get remaining years until retirement. Now this is a very long function name. And I'm going to also add on to my string text within this add event listener. I'm using string interpolation, if you remember that from our previous video. And I'm going to say /, well, I don't have to say /. I'll just go ahead and add on here and say years left until retirement. And then we're going to fill in some information here in between open and closing bracket. But what I'm going to do here is that I'm going to do some calculation. I'm going to take the number of years how old Joe is, and let's say that there's a that the retirement age is going to be, let's say, 65. So I'm going to say var and here I'm defining a local variable, and it's local to this method. And typically, and this is actually what we consider a constant, because it's not going to change during the runtime of our program. And typically with constants, you would uppercase the variable. And that's just a good coding practice. If the value is not going to change during the runtime of your program, uppercase it. And that's just a good coding practice. So here we have retirement age, which is going to be 65. And one of the things about methods is that methods can receive information and return information. If you want to return something from this method, you would use the keyword return, but we'll use that at a different time here. But what we're going to do is we're going to pass in now this is not necessary here, but what we're going to do is we're going to pass in the age of Joe. So we're going to say age, and so we could pass in information to our method. And then here we're going to have our calculation. And we'll say 65 I'm going to declare another variable here. Call this remaining years. I'm only going to declare it, and then I'll assign it here. And I'll just make this a little bit more informative. Because what we're going to pass in is going to be the age of Joe, which is going to be 55, and that's going to be the current age of Joe. And we're just going to subtract the retirement age from the current age. And what we're going to do here is just return, and this is that return statement I was mentioning, remaining years. Now this is kind of I've kind of added another step here. I could have just go ahead and put the return statement here, right? And it's going to return remaining years after this calculation is performed. But just to kind of keep this simple and so you can see it a little bit better, I'll do the calculation first, and then at the bottom of my statement here, I'll write another statement that says return remaining years. Now, if you look at this function here, I only have 1, 2, 3, 4 statements within it. And the sole purpose of this function is to get the retirement, get the years until retirement. And I could call this at any point during my program. So it's a function, it's a set of statements that perform a certain task. It's very specific. Now this is I'm defining a named function. So there's always a two-step process when you're working with functions. One is that you have to define the function, right? So this is my process of defining the function between lines 93 and 102, and I define the function that's going to give me the retirement age. All right. Now your functions may have a lot more statements than this, but nevertheless, this achieves the objective of getting the retirement age. So first step is to define the function. Second step is to call or invoke the function. Now watch where I call and invoke the function. I'm going to call and invoke this function right when the end user clicks on the button to generate the student info. So what I'm going to do here is that one of the first statements I'm going to run is called get remaining years until retirement. And watch this here. I'm going to pass in the student.age. That's already defined here on line 68. Now I don't have to pass this in. I can just pass in any value at this point. I could say 12, right? But that's going to pass in this student. And we're going to talk more about this user defined object in the next video. But that's going to pass in student.age. And so this function is going to invoke, and so this is an example of calling, or some people would like to call this, or invoking a function. Which function are we calling or invoking? It's the function that we defined here on line 94. And remember, we defined one parameter that we'll pass in, and whenever we're defining a function, it's called a parameter that we're defining. And then when we call it, we're passing in an argument. So we have an argument of the student age. What we're going to do is whenever this function calls or invokes, it's going to run the statements and it's going to return back. And so get remaining years until retirement is going to hold a value. The value that's going to hold is going to be the retirement age minus the current age that we passed in. And whatever this function holds, we're going to assign it to a variable. And I'll just call this years left. And these, you can name these variables anything you want. But for lack of better words here, I'm going to say years left. And so years left is what's going to be, it's going to show up as the number of years left that Joe has until retirement. So let's go ahead and save this, Control S, and I'll kind of minimize this so you can actually see all the code here. So what we've done here is that we've created a named function. We've defined a named function. So first step is to define your function. Then the second step is essentially to call your function somewhere in your program, or you could call it invoking your function. All right, so that's going to run this program. Let's first save it, Control S, and then let's bring this up in the browser. Let's right click, open the default browser. And here, this gets the date, and then this is the function where we should see the retirement age. We have an error. Now in the previous video, we talked about how to troubleshoot. So let's go to F12 and let's see where our error may occur. And now F12, I went to console. You'll see that somewhere near line 102 is where my error is occurring. So if I go back, you'll see that essentially, I just named remaining years wrong. So let's go back to our code and let's fix remaining years. Hopefully you can kind of see how that debugging using Google Chrome Developer Tools is extremely helpful. So we save that, and now let's go back to our code here and refresh. I want to get rid of our console there. So here we have the retirement, years left until retirement, 10, right? And so that's coming from that function that we defined, and then we invoked it with an event handler method, or the add event listener method. So hopefully this makes sense in terms of defining a method and then calling and invoking the method. And this is what these next few slides get at here. So this talks about, it kind of gives you the terminology of what we just went over. So every function, you have to use this function keyword whenever you're doing a name function. You give it a name. These are the parameters that's going to be defined on what's going to be passed into the function. You can also return things from the function. But first you define it and then you call it, right? Or you invoke it. Here's an activity that's going to give you some practice with that. So go ahead and pause this video. We're going to work through this together at some point. But go ahead and try to accomplish these 2 bullet points here. And then we also saw an arrow function, right? Where you would use an arrow arrow is the same thing as almost like an anonymous function, but it's a shorter syntax, and you use the arrow to point to whatever's going to be returned from your method, or point to the various statements that will be ran within your method or your function. All right, and like I said, we'll get some more practice with arrow functions, name functions, and anonymous functions. In our next video, we're going to focus on create our own user-defined objects. We'll do a quick review over predefined objects such as the document object, but then we'll quickly transition into our own predefined or our own user-defined objects and how we can actually create those. Hey guys, stay tuned.